Welcome to another edition of The Need for Courage, sponsored by Marquette's Center for Peacemaking. I'm your host today, John Byrne, and with me today is Kathy Kelly. Kathy has had a phenomenal career in peace activism, all sorts of things, and I really appreciate the time she's going to give us. She's a peace activist. She's involved in several organizations. She's received too many awards to count, but we'll talk about a couple of those. So, Kathy, I'll start with this. Thank you for joining us, and maybe give us a snapshot in 2026. Where are we globally and domestically regarding the challenge for peacemakers and nonviolence from your perspective? I know you could talk the whole time about that, but where are we today? So it sort of sets the stage of the many challenges that we have.
Well, thank you, John. I think 2026 is a year of tremendous displacement, agony, despair, anger, because a genocide continues in the Israeli attacks against Palestinians. Ukrainians and Russians are still at war, and enormous suffering on the part of so many people who, I believe, long for an end to war. But at the same time, we see rising amounts of money dedicated to buying weapons, developing, selling, storing weapons, and a rising anxiety. You know, what if the nuclear bomb is used? A tactical nuclear weapon could be used in any one of a number of contexts. We also see the UN kind of taking one thwack after another. International law is flaunted by multiple countries. The International Court of Justice makes rulings and the deadline passes and nobody adheres to them. But we're also, I think, seeing some very important shifts as these temperatures are rising all across Europe, particularly, for instance, in France. And scientists are saying, look, this climate change is causing the rise in temperatures. It's only June and there's a long summer ahead of us. I think people are starting to look at the possibility of environmental collapse, ecological collapse. And I think people are making connections between militarism and climate change, wondering, should we keep putting so much of our wealth and our ingenuity and our resource into war when the wars eventually could undermine our own capacity to survive? So I think we are seeing some shifts. Here in the United States, in the most recent primary elections, it was interesting to see that people in New York, and I think 5 different elections, with ideas that challenge the status quo, particularly with regard to Israel's attacks against Palestinians, won their elections. And so there certainly is tremendous need. And I would never want to minimize what people in war zones or people trapped in prisons undergo. But we ought not give up hope.
Yeah, I appreciate that. So this week, I'm sure, as you know, as we're recording this, the Supreme Court came down with a couple of decisions, and one of those decisions supports the current administration's elimination, basically, of the temporary protective status. And I know one of the countries that's going to be impacted by this is certainly El Salvador and many others. But I wanted to have you talk about some of the countries that you've been engaged in, and then we certainly can come back here. But, obviously there's going to be economic impacts of the temporary protection status going away. I've read some stories today that not many of us, but some forget that the Haitian community that's come to the States, many of them are in the nursing industry. So they care for our elderly, they care for our disabled, and that's going to impact that activity clearly. But more importantly, these people have been here for so long. They're vibrant parts of our society, and this has to be heartbreaking what's going on. But maybe talk a bit about some of the countries that you've worked with, because I think El Salvador is one that's definitely going to be impacted by this. So talk a bit about that, and then obviously some of the other countries that you've engaged in over the course of your career.
Well, I think you're so right about the benefits of bringing people into our country who do many of the jobs that are vitally needed and maybe not everybody wants to do. And Haiti is such a dangerous country for people to return to right now. Decades and decades of impoverishment, corruption, have affected that country. I spent a summer living there, and I remember there was a little girl, Natasha, and it would brighten my day. She'd come running, if I stepped out the door where she was our next door neighbor, and she'd come running, and I'd pick her up and swing her around. And one morning I walked out, and, little Natasha didn't come running. She was kind of looking away, and I wondered, did I say something to hurt that child's feelings yesterday? And I walked closer, and then I saw the little tiny stones glistening on her lips. And Natasha didn't come running because I had walked out and caught her eating dirt. And, her mother was a single mother. They had been affected by a capsized boat, and the father had died in that. I mean, the nightmare fears that people have when they flee countries, these are their homes. They don't want to leave their homes.
Sure.
But they leave with great fear. And I think about the people of El Salvador who you might say converted Archbishop Romero, who is now a saint. He was a pretty conservative archbishop, really. But because of the death of a Jesuit priest who was his good friend, Rutilio Grande, he started to rethink. And then he had this radio show, and the poorest people in El Salvador were always welcomed to come and join him. And they converted Archbishop Romero into someone who cared intensely about the ways that Salvadorans were being repressed. And toward the end of his life, he gave a very ringing homily and put it in a letter. And he said, in the name of God, in the name of your suffering brothers and sisters, I beg you, I order you, stop the repression. And then he was assassinated shortly after that. But, in the days when I had graduated from university and graduate study, Central Americans made a huge difference in our lives in the cities, particularly where a lot of the Catholic worker communities were. But you learned a lot from the people who'd come. They'd fled, and you wonder, what did they come to our neighborhood for? It's the poorest neighborhood in Chicago at the time where I lived. But they needed the lower income, the lower rents. And eventually, it's interesting to me, John, that it was somewhat accessible for peace activists to go to Central America. I mean, it wasn't that far away. You could learn Spanish. You could, mingle with neighbors who were from Central American countries. And so if people were going to take a summer vacation, they'd often decide to, pick coffee in Nicaragua or join with people in their communities in El Salvador. If they were going to have a book club or a study club, it was about liberation theology. And, if you were celebrating a liturgy, why not do the Misa Campesina? And, even their clothing choices reflected a relatively easy identification with Central American neighbors. But then when the United States pivoted toward war against Iraq, there was not any of that familiarity. And, very few people spoke Arabic. A professor at Marquette, Louise Kankar, had learned Arabic. And I knew people all around the world who were relying on her because she could talk to people. We didn't share easily the same faith base or norms and customs. And what happened then is that it became easier for the United States military and State Department to just kind of lump everybody in the country of Iraq into one person, Saddam Hussein. And he could easily be demonized, and he was a ruthless and a terrible dictator. But when economic sanctions were imposed on Iraq, and I think that's a form of warfare, those economic sanctions didn't necessarily make Saddam Hussein miss a meal. The ones who were hurt, and they were lethally, brutally punished, although they hadn't committed any crime and they meant us in the United States no harm, were elderly people and impoverished people, and then in a horrific way, children. And so the United Nations was reporting first that there were hundreds of children who died as a direct result of United States UN economic sanctions. And then they said, well, actually it's thousands. And then there was a report that estimated 500,000 children had died because of the economic sanctions, 500,000 children. And still, there was no let-up. The United States wouldn't ease up on these economic sanctions. So that's when a number of us said, okay, we can't possibly be a humanitarian relief group, but we do know a bit about using nonviolent civil disobedience. So we wrote to the U.S. State Department and we declared our intent to break the economic sanctions by bringing medicine to hospitals and children and families. And we got a letter back from OFAC, the Office of Foreign Assets Control, like immediately saying, you do that, and you'll risk 12 years in prison, a $1 million fine, and a $250,000 administrative penalty. So we wrote back and we said, thank you for the clarity of the warning. We understood the penalties in the first place. Right. We find that we can't be governed by unjust laws, and we invite you to join us. So that started 13 years of ultimately 70 delegations, all in defiance of the economic sanctions, going to Iraq. And then we remained in Iraq during the shock and awe bombing.
You know, what's interesting about that, and I told you before we recorded, that that comes in my world, the issues of sanctions and financial crime prevention, because financial institutions, like other companies, have to respond to blocking activity and all the things that sanctions require. But I don't think there's been enough coverage of how sanctions can impact and do impact day-to-day citizens. There's been some academics that have written about that, but I think in general, again, the anti-money laundering professionals in my world, their job is to, follow the OFAC requirements, the UN requirements, what have you, which, are challenging enough. I don't think enough professionals understand the unintended impacts that you folks have identified. So I think that's an important spotlight that we just don't see enough of. But I definitely have read more studies that have shown what you've indicated, that it does harm citizens, can actually result in death because of the inability to get access to food and water and medicine and even funding. I will tell you that we did some work with the World Bank years ago to try to figure out how to help some of these charities. And I do remember somebody from a Syrian relief organization, and they were talking to us as part of the financial industry and said, some cases, the banks will send wire transfers and will send the money that we need. But because there's some hurdles in what they do before we get the dollars, if things are 2 or 3 weeks late, people die. So that really resonated in the room, and certainly with what you've just talked about. So again, I appreciate the fact that you've seen this up close and personal, because I don't think professionals always understand those impacts.
I've been so impressed by doctors who have gone over to hospitals and places where, the doctors in the affected hospital where items are sanctioned don't have the equipment anymore to diagnose disease, or, they get a blood bag and they have to make a choice. Do I give it to the newborn who just came into the world, or to a mother who might be dying? The angst and exhaustion that's felt by many people who are trying to supply what, civilian populations need, sewage and sanitation and transportation, it exhausts and wearies people and begins to break them down. And I think it's not something that very often makes it into the news. I remember we were in Baghdad and a team of reporters, this was pretty close to that imminent shock and awe bombing. And finally, some reporters actually came to Iraq for most of those 13 years of economic sanctions. The Milwaukee newspaper came over, and they were one of the very few in the United States that ever sent a reporter and a photographer. But these were pretty mainstream, big outlet people who had come together. And I said, they actually asked to talk with our group, and they were wanting to know what we felt they should report on. And I said, you should go to the hospitals and talk to these doctors and interview the patients. A nurse was with me recently, and he said, it's like a death row for infants, isn't it? A death row for infants. And I remember an NPR reporter said, oh, no, we're not going to be dupes for Saddam Hussein. He felt that these hospitals must be sort of like Potemkin villages, showcase pretend scenes. But they weren't pretend, they were real. And we had gone to hospitals in the north, the center, and the south of Iraq, and you saw the same pattern repeated. Children wizened up, losing the juices in their bodies, starving, tortured, really. And so then the reporter from NPR said, well, actually, there is something I do want to do here in Baghdad. My son is a coin collector, and I hear that there's a place on Booksellers Row where you can see coins. Where is that? And I said, the Irish temper was about to go
Right.
through the ceiling. So it was very hard to get people to report. But now with Gaza under siege, that sense of exhaustion and weariness, it seems to me to be one of the cruelest impositions of siege and bombing and targeting for assassination. And then who do they especially boost to the top of the lists that are created through the high-tech, capacity for algorithms to, survey cell phone information and other information. And the people that go to the top of the list are the ones who've witnessed atrocities. So 260 journalists in Gaza have been killed. They've been burnt in their press tents. They've been hunted down like prey and targeted by quadcopters and snipers. Sometimes their families have been killed as well. And it's a very courageous thing for a young person to put on that press vest and a helmet. And now in Lebanon also, the same thing. 11 Lebanese press people have been killed in just the past few weeks, and they're very young. The others who are killed who witness atrocities are the doctors and the nurses and the healthcare delivery people, the ambulance drivers. And when they aren't killed, they're very often either maimed or imprisoned and tortured while in prison. So we need more witnessing. I'm so grateful to the people who've organized the flotillas that have, by boat, tried to establish a humanitarian corridor for goods to get to Gaza, but also have witnessed the atrocities, and they themselves were tortured and in some cases really abused very, very terribly, but they haven't quit.
Some of what you've done in your career has been part of different organizations. One of the major reasons, besides learning from folks like yourself, the center is very interested in how do we expose students and others to, there are a variety of ways in which you can participate. I know some of these organizations may no longer exist, but can you talk a little bit about your Voices in the Wilderness organization, and then more recently, what is the World Beyond War? What do they do? But just in general about, you don't have to be part of an organization to make a difference, but obviously banding together does increase strength. So talk a bit about that and some of the organizations you've worked with or even led during your career.
Well, when I was a young teacher at St. Ignatius College Prep, I remember going to the treasurer and saying, "John, could you lower my salary beneath the taxable income?" And I think he was thinking, could I get the school psychiatrist here? But I felt so strongly that I didn't want to pay for nuclear weapons. And so war tax refusal was a relief in a way. And what I found is that amongst the community of war tax refusers, you found many of the people who'd also found their way to the Catholic worker and were quite happy to live simply and share resources and try particularly to serve various people whose needs weren't being met. And in whatever way they could to sort of direct funds away from militarism and toward caring for others. Well, that same population were the group who would be willing to risk the high fines and possible imprisonment that's involved when you, for instance, try to deliver medical supplies to Iraq. So we were a good, sturdy combination of people like Jesuit founder of the Marquette Center, Simon Herrick, Father John Deere, who went over to Iraq and Afghanistan and Northern Ireland, and many people that were part of the Catholic worker movement. And we formed communities, and those communities were durable. And then we were able to form communities almost feeling like a familial link with quite a few families in Iraq. And now we find that actually is affected by the internet, because even if you can't make a personal appearance, you can still stay in touch. And so every Monday I'm on a phone call. We call it Global Solidarity for Peace in Palestine, but we hear from the Palestinians every Monday. And it's heartbreaking, but it's important to keep those personal connections. And I'm fortunate that I'd gone to Afghanistan about 30 times. And well, when the Taliban took over in Afghanistan, the very young people who welcomed us were at risk, serious risk, because they welcomed us. And they were never paid a dime by us. They were completely volunteer. but they needed to run. And so we've, over the last 5 years, been able to help about 100 of those former Afghan peace volunteers to resettle in safer havens. And it's been a joy to get to know the young people in their new circumstances, but everybody misses that sense of what home means to them. It's not just a building. And you wonder, will people ever sense that they're at home? So I think it's very important to welcome those who come into our country as newcomers and not threaten them and not put a stigma on them or feel that they are a burden. I mean, who isn't an immigrant into the United States except for the native indigenous population? So one thing I like about World Beyond War, I'm the board president for World Beyond War, is we try hard not to have a main address. We really want it to be worldwide, and we don't want to cherry pick. We don't want to say, well, I really don't like this war, but that war is necessary. We're like the main t-shirt that people sell says, I'm already against the next war. So there's a map that's maintained by a Gazan, a young Gazan man in India. He just finished his PhD, but it's a global map of all the bases worldwide. There are over 800, and the U.S. runs close to 800 of those bases. And if you start to imagine, well, what if that base closed down? Often the land was stolen in the first place. But what if the land and the resources were returned to the people who lived there, and they didn't have to sustain U.S. troops and the chemical problems that come with our militarism and the reality that in some places, because the people have a U.S. base on their soil, they become targets, as happened in some of the Gulf states as the United States went to war with Iran. So I think the rationality of saying no more war comes to light, particularly when you think about what really threatens us. Nuclear weapons, ecological collapse, new pandemics, and now genocide becoming normal. And militaries aren't going to be able to help us in those regards. So Dan Berrigan was very, very clear on this. He said, one of the reasons we don't have peace is because the peacemakers aren't required to make the same risks that the soldiers have to take. A soldier can't say, well, I changed my mind, or I would, but the wife and kids didn't like it. If a soldier is deployed, they go. But for the peace movement, we don't make that total commitment so readily. And I think that's what we need to aim toward. And I think we saw young people make that kind of commitment in the student encampments that happened about 2 years ago now. They were brilliant. They understood nonviolence so well, and they incorporated into their encampments, and they were determined, and they were taking risks. And I don't think they were properly thanked by administrations. Quite the opposite.
Well, clearly you have walked the walk because you've served prison time for some of your protests. I know you're very humble, and it's not anything other than explaining to listeners today the situation around that, because it does show a number of things, but obviously you knew that was going to happen. Just talk a little bit about that experience.
Well, we were in the uptown area of Chicago and in Milwaukee and Madison and Kansas City, a group of people who thought, a nuclear war really could happen. And what could we do? And we thought, and we met for retreats, and a group met in my apartment every Friday night after soup kitchen for a year. And finally we said, okay, let's do it. We'll plant corn on top of the nuclear missile silo sites outside of Kansas City, Missouri. There were 150 and 1,000 in silos with intercontinental ballistic missiles in the Midwest. So we did that. We planted our corn, and I got a year in federal prison for it. It was a brilliant day. I remember the soldier who had a gun aimed at my head. Eventually, I think I lasted maybe about a minute and a half in silence, and then I started talking to him. And I never turned around and looked at him, but eventually I asked him if he thought the corn would grow. And he said, I don't know, ma'am, but I sure hope so. And then he asked me, ma'am, would you please tip your head back? And I did, and he poured water down my throat. which was very, very kind. And I think that his question, would you like a drink of water? Would you tip your head back? If instead of securing and guarding and pampering the weapon systems, we could ask his question, to people who are thirsty and starving and forcibly displaced from their homes, we'd be so much better off. But among those people who are kind of displaced from their homes are the prisoners. And boy, I would never, John, never have understood the extent of racism in the U.S. criminal justice system without going into the prison and sitting on bedsides next to prisoners. And you get it. You understand the grief and the separation, the isolation, the fear that, their children won't remember what they look like. And people, when I first went to prison, it was 1988, there was one woman in the whole prison who had gotten a 10-year sentence. And we were all sort of dumbfounded, like, wow, 10 years. But the last time I went to prison in 2016 for trying to deliver a loaf of bread to a military commander at Whiteman Air Force Base and a letter about drone warfare, 8 and 10 and 12 and 14-year sentences were common. And so, the criminal justice system has many, many, many locations and beds. And I think, the colleges and universities talk about the demographic cliff, like, oh, the baby boomers aren't having so many, their children aren't having so many children. And what if we can't fill the classroom seats? Well, I worry that the prison industrial complex will wonder, how are we going to fill all these prison beds? Well, we could lock up the migrants or, be careful. They could lock up other groups who fall out of favor with authoritarian governments. So we should stand together and seek solidarity. It's in the interest of all of us in the face of rising oligarchical and authoritarian governance.
Kathy, I really appreciate you spending time with us today. Let me get you out of here on this sort of a two-part question. Given what you've already mentioned, how can people get engaged? Variety of ways. What's good source material for that? But if somebody's trying to further understand some of the things you've already talked about, where can they go to get more information? Obviously, there's local organizations you can be part of, but as you say, it doesn't have to be. It can be electronic. It could be in person. Obviously, protesting is a proper way to participate. But if you're talking to a potential peacemaker, what do you tell him or her in terms of, here's some things you could consider to be more involved because you have the passion for it. You just are not sure where to take that energy.
Well, if you spread the peanut butter too thin, the bread rips. And so it's good to focus, but you can't know right away, what do I most want to focus on? And I think that the electronic research is a good thing. I strongly recommend World Beyond War's website. It is just chock-a-block full of sorted by countries or themes or events that are coming up. It's got a very good wealth of information, and we're fortunate to have chapters in places all around the world, including Africa and Central America and Europe and Asia. I also think it's a good idea to find the nearest local Catholic worker house or shelter or soup kitchen and just go get to know the people that are coming as guests and also those who are keeping it going. And a lot of times those are the people who are very, very involved in activities locally that challenge issues with regard to justice and anti-war efforts. So I think that's terrifically important. And then find kindred spirits. You don't have to say, these are my best friends, but look for the kindred spirits on a campus and maybe they'll be amongst the faculty, maybe they'll be amongst the secretaries or janitors at the institution, but find people who share your values and desires. And I often say to people, follow the young people. The young people in Jewish Voice for Peace are so well organized and filled with enthusiasm and vigor. And now there's a Young People's Catholic Caucus for the Christians for a Free Palestine. And I learned so much from them. It's been a delight to be in touch with people. And then also, there was a Catholic worker some years back who's died now, but he said to me, Kathy, why don't you include more artwork in your presentations and I said, okay. And that's been really important for me. Dance and music and paintings. There's just a wealth to enrich us that can be found, in the art department on your campus. So keep the imagination going.
All right, Kathy Kelly, thank you for your time today. Really appreciate it. And more importantly, it's been an honor to talk to you, the work that you've done, where many have recognized it. I know you didn't do any of it for awards, but people take a look at your bio, you'll see you've been doing this for decades. So thank you so much. Stay safe, and we'll talk again soon. But the Center for Peacemaking appreciates your hard work, and we want to continue that, like you say, get the young people who we know have the passion for this to find ways to participate. And you've given us a lot to chew on there. So thank you so much.
Thank you, John. I greatly enjoyed being on this podcast, and I'll look forward to future ones.